Today is Thursday, December 2nd, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. I was asked if I would do a talk today about a topic that I had mentioned in another talk in which I referred to an exercise that I used to use in teaching disputation and reasoning to students when I was a private school teacher. What I did at the school was develop a course that I called Christian Rhetoric, and I taught students the principles of classical rhetoric, which was a relatively light study. Rhetoric really isn't a complicated art to learn the principles of. It's a difficult art to actually practice. And we really can't practice it too much through artificial exercises because the real work of rhetoric has to do with real men and real audiences and real cases, real themes, real questions, real problems, and the emotion and urgency of those circumstances all contributes to the rhetoric that's employed by the rhetorician. So the principles are easy to learn. Aristotle's Rhetoric compared to Aristotle's Organon is just one book compared to 6. And so when we think about rhetoric compared to reasoning, it's a relatively simple study, and it takes the rest of our life to practice. So I taught a course in Christian rhetoric, but what we did in the classroom throughout the entire year was have disputations to work on reasoning. Because if you study Aristotle's Rhetoric, you'll know that what he teaches is that the most important element of true persuasion is the logical argument, is credibility. This is why he says that rhetoric is counterpart to dialectic or reasoning. We can try to persuade people based on the influence of our own character, which is referred to as ethos. We can try to persuade people based on the influence of emotion, which is pathos. But ultimately, the most effective source of persuasion, being that we're rational creatures, is the persuasion that is produced through clear and conclusive logical arguments, and referred to as logos. And so I used the time in class to teach the students the basic principles of the art of reasoning, and more importantly, to drill and exercise them in disputations where they would practice the art of reasoning. If we look at Aristotle's Organon, it begins with the categories and on interpretation, which really can be boiled down into the need to carefully define terms and understand what makes for a proposition. Very simple to teach. Of course, you can get into details and seek real mastery in these things, and you need to do that at some point. But to present students in a modern school that get nothing of classical instruction with at least an overview is simple enough. And then when we get into the analytics in the Organon, we have the actual structure of a syllogism which illustrates for us how reasoning actually works. The students in a modern school don't have the opportunity to study these works or learn this theory and since time is limited, as a teacher, I wanted to make the best possible use of their time that I could and give them as much as I could. And I believed that much more would come to them through practice and experience, so they can at least learn what it feels like to be proven wrong or to prove something true, to demonstrate something. Once you get a taste for demonstration, you can't forget it. And that's an important experience in the life of a student. So I structured a course that I called Christian Rhetoric, and I would teach the kids the principles of rhetoric, the basic principles of reasoning, and we'd use all of our class time for disputations. And disputations are a formal type of argument where a controversial question is asked and a student prepares a response through which he answers that question and seeks to demonstrate as far as possible that his answer is the true answer to that question. And there are rules for disputations. Don't get this confused with any modern debate club or any of that modern stuff. It has nothing to do with the modern debate club thing. This is about classical disputations. This is an exercise that can be used every day by Christian people. It's not an idle, artificial academic exercise. It's simply the process by which we answer questions and seek to demonstrate our answers. So what I would have the students do is choose for themselves a controversial question that they would answer. And I allowed them to choose their own questions because I wanted it to be something that they cared about, something that they knew something about. So athletes might take up a question like whether performing enhancing drugs should be permitted in sports. Another student might take up whether marijuana should be legalized. Another student might take up a question like whether premarital sex is evil. They would pick whatever kind of question they wanted, and they would have as much time as they wanted to prepare their response. And when their response was ready, they had to come in front of the class and present their response. And their response largely followed the structure of an article in Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica, which is simply a collection of disputations. And I would have the students do this, and at the beginning of the year, they would be totally clueless and terrible at it. And after being humiliated a couple of times, they would start to get better. They would see someone take a chance and provide a good response, and they would see what a good response looks like. They would start to get a sense of what a good response feels like. And they had until the end of the year, or really the end of the marking period, to produce a successful response. And the course was pass-fail. You either produced a successful response or you didn't. And if you didn't, you failed for the marking period. So it was a high-stress course for these kids because this is a college preparatory school and their grades are no joke. They had as many opportunities as they wanted, and they could schedule themselves to give their response whenever they wanted. But they had to deliver a successful response in order to pass the class. And so it was high stakes. It was serious. It was emotional. The environment was right for disputation. Their biggest fear was that I would find fault with their response in class and present an objection that they couldn't answer. Because if an objection was raised to an assertion that they made or to an argument that they made, they had to refute that objection or fail. And so they had to prepare their response and anticipate objections so that they could respond. And this exercise of disputation helped them in a million different ways, because they immediately learned that every subject area of knowledge is important. Arguments could be raised from mathematics, arguments could be raised from the natural sciences, arguments could be raised from theology, history, any area could provide reasons for objections. And the students would feel how inadequate they were to answer to objections, because they have the modern sort of ignorance across the curriculum, have maybe their favorite pet subject and neglect the rest. And they realized in disputations you can't do that. You can't think like that. You can't answer questions like that. And so other teachers were so excited because this class was making the students zealous in all their classes. The good teachers, that was. The bad teachers hated me because the kids came to their classes asking questions, demanding proofs, asking for evidence, and humiliated the teachers. And those teachers hated my rhetoric class because it was good for the students. And they couldn't handle questioning students asking for evidence. But the good teachers immediately saw the improvement in the kids' behavior in their classes. And that's the effect that it had on the kids' learning in general. It made them zealous because they saw that information learned in any class could be used in the preparation of a presentation or in raising objections to a presentation. After a year or two of these disputations, they really became popular among the students, so much so that older students who completed the class would come back to sit in on the classes and participate in the disputations. The classroom would be packed. I'd have juniors and seniors coming back to sit in on the disputations and giving up study halls and early dismissal opportunities to participate in these classes. Students loved them. But every year, I would give my own presentation, my own response to a controversial question. And the students waited for it every year because it was a ridiculous topic, and my response, my answer was even more ridiculous. But what I told the students was that I would win and successfully respond and refute all objections, no matter what they think, no matter how confident they are that they could get me, that I would win. And that it was my knowledge of the art of reasoning, the subtleties of the art of reasoning, and more importantly, the doctrine of the sophistical elenchi, as they're called, that would allow me to escape their challenges and objections. And it drove the kids crazy because I would do it year after year. Kids even knew it was coming. Older students who had been through the disputation, and they would come back with new arguments, and it went on year after year. The question that I chose to answer in my disputation response was whether Diet Coke is healthier than orange juice. And this topic actually came up because my lunch each day used to be a sandwich that my wife would pack for me and a can of Diet Coke. That's just what I ate. I never had a lunch break. I would just quickly eat a sandwich, have a can of Diet Coke on my desk, and I'd worry about eating when I got home. And so the kids used to pick on me, especially the athletes, about me drinking diet soda. And one day, one of the kids in my class who went on to become a professional soccer player was picking on me about my diet soda, joking around. And I said, my diet soda is healthier than your orange juice, because he had an orange juice sitting on his desk. And I said, my diet soda is healthier than your orange juice. And I went on to pretend that I was serious, that diet soda is actually healthier than orange juice. And so I promised him that I would take that up as a disputation question and prove that diet soda was healthier than orange juice. And that's where this disputation started. And then when we actually went through the disputation and they all left feeling that they were persuaded that diet soda was healthier than orange juice, it became this interesting, funny but not funny topic to constantly discuss. And everyone wanted to present an argument and get in on it, and I would tell them, no, we'll take that up on a scheduled day when we'll do my annual response to the question whether Diet Coke is healthier than orange juice. Now, I knew that the students had no way of possibly winning a disputation against me because they simply don't know the subtleties of reasoning, and they don't know sophistical elenchi, or sophistical arguments. That is, arguments that have an appearance of being true, but that cannot be discerned except by one who has a mastery of the actual art of reasoning. This is the purpose of Aristotle's Organon. And I knew that there was no way that the kids would ever be able to trap me, because I could always slither out of their grip. That's what the sophists used to do in the past. So I knew I could go into this and that I would never actually get caught. Even though they could close in on me and get me cornered at times, I would find a way to slip out and avoid getting captured. And this drove them crazy, because it really appeared to them like I refuted every objection. And they were baffled by it. They were simultaneously laughing, but also wondering how they could be losing. And what it did for them was make them appreciate just how powerful and effective sophistry can be. It put them on guard. how easily a sophist can mislead people. And even though you may know or think you know that what he's saying is not true, yet you can't prove it. And so I did this exercise year after year and presented my response to the question whether Diet Coke was healthier than orange juice, to give them a taste of the power of sophistry. Since that's the last book of Aristotle's Organon, it was sort of the conclusion of the course and the completion of their introduction to classical reasoning. So what I had to do for my response was to come up with a few positive arguments, reasons why I could suggest that Diet Coke was healthier than orange juice. I had to come up with a few positive arguments, and that wasn't too difficult. So what I would start out with is something like, in America, one of the greatest health crises that we face is obesity. And anyone who consults a nutritionist or a physician and expresses a desire to lose weight will be advised to avoid fruit juices. And I could present all kinds of supporting evidence from 1,000 different sources showing that physicians and nutritionists advised men and women to avoid fruit juices because they're high in calories, high in sugars, and they can contribute to weight gain. And so I would conclude that because obesity is one of the primary health risks in America, and because fruit juices contribute to obesity, whereas Diet Coke does not contribute to obesity, therefore, Diet Coke is healthier than orange juice. And as I completed that first argument, the kids would all kind of start nodding in assent, like, okay, we'll give you that one. That's pretty good. But I could feel them starting to get antsy because that's a pretty good argument. And so then I would move on to additional arguments. And I wasn't concerned too much with the positive arguments because I knew that I would win the day by responding to the obvious objections that they would raise. So, for example, one of the objections would always be something like, there's a video on YouTube where a person poured diet soda on the hood of a car and the diet soda ate through the paint. And they would argue that diet soda is a corrosive, harsh chemical. How could it be healthy? And so, with my background in the natural sciences and chemistry, I could easily start throwing at them all kinds of scientific information and talk about the fact that diet soda, in drinking diet soda, we're not pouring it on the hood of a car, we're pouring it into our own bodies, and the acidity, the pH level of our gastric acids is already more acidic than the diet soda itself. In fact, our gastric acid is even more dangerous, speaking from the perspective of chemicals and corrosiveness and so on, than any diet soda. And I would just show them, here's the pH of diet soda, here's the pH of our gastric acids, And therefore, since we're putting this diet soda into an environment that's already acidic, even more acidic, that's irrelevant. And that would be one objection checked. Everybody would laugh, they would kind of look at each other, and they'd look around for who was going to raise the next objection. And the next objection would usually be something like, orange juice is natural and diet soda is not natural. And I would refute that claim, and I would say, actually, orange juice is not natural. And I argued that God did not create orange juice. Man makes orange juice. God created oranges, and in oranges, there's only a certain amount of juice present for someone to consume naturally. And therefore, if we wanted to talk about the natural orange juice, we would only be able to talk about the juice that's contained in an orange. And it's limited in the amount that can be consumed by the body and fiber and pulp of the orange itself. I said, who knows how much or how many oranges are required to make a glass of orange juice? And they would come up with some crazy number. They'd look it up on their phones and find out how many oranges it took to make a glass of orange juice. And I said, how many of you would ever think of sitting and eating that many oranges? And of course it was ridiculous. And so I would say, therefore, the glass of orange juice is actually not natural, but is a beverage created by man, where man takes some natural ingredients, to be sure, but prepares them in a way that is itself not natural. And I said, the same thing can be said of diet soda. Diet soda is prepared from all natural ingredients. I said, what do you think? Do you think that we go to Mars and get ingredients to bring back to the earth to make diet soda? Everything in a can of diet soda is from nature. It's from the earth. It's natural. And in the same way, and not in any greater sense, is a glass of orange juice said to be natural. And with that, I would dismiss the refutation that orange juice was natural and diet soda was not natural. And you can imagine by that point, those really were the two greatest arguments that would be raised, the objections that would be raised. The idea that somehow diet soda is a harsh chemical and really shouldn't be consumed, and that it's not natural. It's sort of an artificial beverage, and therefore what's artificial must be less healthy than what is quote-unquote natural. Once we got through those objections, there would be additional objections like orange juice has vitamin C in it, has vitamins and minerals in it. Diet soda doesn't necessarily have vitamins and minerals in it. And I would explain that the purpose of a beverage is not to provide the diet's nutritional content, because if a beverage was judged to be healthy by whether or not it provided nutrients and minerals, then water would be an unhealthy beverage because it has no vitamins or minerals. And I would just dismiss the nutritional content objection by saying that if diet soda is unhealthy, then water is unhealthy by that same argument. And that would be dismissed. And we'd go on and we'd go on, argument after argument. After a while, the kids would realize one thing, and this was the purpose of this exercise. What they realized was they really didn't have any significant objections most of what they said was kind of half-baked, not serious talk, that they were repeating things they had heard before, and they really had nothing invested in the points that they raised. And when I would dismiss them and refute them, or appear to refute them, they wouldn't be too concerned with fighting for them. But there were a couple of lessons that I wanted the kids to learn. The first and most important lesson is that our society is an ignorant, uneducated society. And what's deceiving about our society is that when we talk about education, we allow formal schooling to substitute for the idea of education. We allow education credentials from formal schooling to be presented as some kind of proof that someone is educated. And these credentials have nothing to do with true education. The fact that a person has a high school diploma does not mean that he's literate. The fact that a person has a bachelor's degree does not mean that he's reasonable. The fact that a person has a master's degree or even a PhD or professional degree does not mean that he's a wise man. And yet, we often allow this artificial world of academic programs and academic certificates and licenses and diplomas and degrees to be substituted for real learning and education, real wisdom. We don't check facts. We don't ask for proofs. We usually search until we find the answer that we want, and then we rest. And if you don't test the ideas, when you present them to someone else, they're easily dismissed, and you have no real substance in what you say or what you argue. You say things that you don't have any evidence for. You say things because they're sort of generally agreed upon by others, or at least they seem to be agreed upon by others, and no one ever asks you for proof. And you're used to living in this lazy American society, usually surrounded by people who agree with you. And the ideas that you take for granted and never examine, never seek conviction for, never seek evidence for, never exercise yourself in defending, you just assume that you will always be surrounded by people who already agree with you and simply pretend to be persuaded. And when you engage with someone who actually doesn't agree with you and challenges you on an assertion that you lazily take for granted, you are not capable of providing evidence for the assertions you make. And for a kid to realize that at 16, 17, 18 years old is very important, especially as they're preparing, hopefully, to attend a selective university where they're going to be immersed in a diverse intellectual community and not just be shuttled off into another closed community surrounded by people who already share their beliefs without any examination, which is not true learning. And the kids find that any time that I ask them to give evidence or prove an assertion that they make where they can't just take it for granted, they have absolutely nothing to say. And that's an important lesson for the kids to learn. That what you say at home that might persuade mommy or daddy, what you say in class that might persuade a Christian teacher who already agrees with you, not because the two of you have thoroughly examined a question and put it to the test and found the proof and are convicted of that truth based upon proof that you have in your hand at all times, but simply because it's part of the statement of faith of the institution and is not questioned. That's a false sense of conviction that is normal in Christian society today. This is especially problematic in our society where people talk about science. Everyone talks about science. Everyone makes arguments from science. And what I ask is, who has in their hand direct access to the evidence that proves any claim that is supposedly made by quote-unquote science? Who has access to the proofs? Who has access to the experiments that have been performed across all the different fields of study and disciplines? Who actually has any access to this evidence that science has supposedly assembled? There is no one that we talk to day by day who talks about things in the name of science and presents science as some kind of authority who has access to any of the actual conclusions demonstrated through reproducible scientific experiments. Science has been given more liberty than any religious authority has ever been given in the history of the world. You can say almost anything you want and attribute it to science. None of us have access to the evidence. And none of this scientific opinion, I don't even think we can say teaching, is even stable or certain, but is constantly being questioned. Much of it is mere theory, and yet is presented as established fact. And these things are not taught in the kids' science classes, where they're just studying to pass a test, and they're receiving the worst possible introduction to the idea of the scientific method or experimental science. Think about it. Kids sign up for a school biology class. They're not taken out into the woods to begin experimenting. They're handed a textbook that's filled from front to back with assertions about the natural world that are not demonstrated to them, but are presented to them to be received by faith and regurgitated for a grade on an exam. This is what science actually means in American education. And much of the content that's in the science textbook can contradict ideas that were held for thousands of years by history's wisest and holiest men. And the textbook is received with greater authority than any of those men, because the children are taught that somewhere, in some remote place, everything contained in the science book has been scientifically, reproducibly demonstrated through experimentation. And it's not true. This science is largely a religion that's being inculcated to the children, and they are simply imbibing it, regurgitating it, and then walking around asserting these things as if someone somewhere has published the evidence, and it's our responsibility to go and find it. This is what science has done in modern society. So between untested, unexamined Christian beliefs and mindlessly imbibed scientific assertions, these kids have been led to believe that they believe and know things with certainty. And yet, if they're questioned, they have no answers. If they're asked for evidence, they have no evidence. And they can laugh in a class like this. They can enjoy the exercise. But after this class is over, I used to have a serious talk with the kids and say, listen, what just happened in that disputation is a serious matter. I know it was intentionally sophistical. And I would never argue in any positive way that diet soda was actually healthier than orange juice. It's a ridiculous argument. But the real issue is that all of the assertions that you kids made, all of the things that you said, all of the truths that you appealed to, you had no support. You had no way to defend. You had no way to furnish evidence for those things, and yet you talked about them as if you were certain of them. But you are not actually certain of them. You simply haven't been challenged on them. And your commitment to them, when you are challenged, is going to be found to be very weak. And as long as you can stay in a little bubble where you're not going to be challenged on them, you can continue to tell yourself that you're safe, just like a nation that remains in peace can continue to tell themselves that they're strong and ready for war. The purpose of the Olympic Games in the ancient world was to allow men to exercise themselves in the skills of war during times of peace. All of the ancient Olympic activities were components of military activities where men could keep themselves fit and strong for military activities and practice skills that were useful in battle, like throwing javelins, archery contests, wrestling, boxing, running. All of these Olympic contests were intended to prepare men for battle. And there's sayings in military circles like, whoever sweats the most during times of peace bleeds the least in times of war, things like that. The idea that we train ourselves and subject ourselves to discipline and training that's even more intense than the war itself prepares us for the challenges of war. And yet what we're doing in Christian society, what we're doing in Christian schools and in churches is the opposite. We're not exercising the kids. We're not demonstrating the truths of the faith to the kids. We're not furnishing them with the knowledge of the definitions and axioms and proofs on which Christian philosophy is based. We're simply calling anyone who questions our so-called beliefs or teachings, we're just calling them bad guys and trying to keep them out of our schools and out of our churches and out of our houses so that we can continue to tell ourselves that we're strong in faith and that we have great convictions. But the truth is, we're like people who believe that they're strong and agile, yet engage in no contests. The purpose of schooling is not supposed to be a place where children are taught the doctrines of their parents' religion and protected from any examination of those ideas. Rather, the school is supposed to be a place where the children are presented with the faith of their fathers and are shown the evidences and proofs for that set of religious beliefs, which for Catholics consists of both theological truths and philosophical truths. Much of the Christian faith is based not on verses of the Bible or teachings of the church, because the church has never taught authoritatively as if it is the source of truth itself. The church has always demonstrated its teachings by appeals either to philosophical arguments or to divine revelation. When we look around and see that students are not learning the sources for the Catholic faith, they're not learning Christian philosophy, nor are they learning the proofs for Christian philosophy. In fact, St. Thomas Aquinas would argue that Christianity is the only system of beliefs that agrees with what can be demonstrated philosophically. And I know that's a lot to take in. But the strength of the Christian faith is actually in its proofs. And what we find is that when kids step out of that bubble, they do not have the strength of convictions to be willing to lose something for those doctrines, to sacrifice something for those principles. They'll acknowledge them in an environment where it pays to acknowledge them. But in the world, when those doctrines become a source of apparent loss for these children. They've never had to choose these doctrines and suffer for them in any way. They've never had to argue and defend these doctrines. They've never had to endure the doubt and confusion created by a good objection or an apparently persuasive presentation on an opposing doctrine. They don't know what it will feel like to hold to a set of beliefs or a specific doctrine when that doctrine costs them something. And because they don't really know the foundation of that doctrine, they really don't hold that doctrine with any certainty. They don't have the evidence at hand. It's all the more easy to let go of and imagine and tell ourselves that it's not a big deal. Well, I need a job because I have to buy a car and I have to pay for car insurance and I have to pay for gas, and the only job I can find is asking me to work on Sundays, and I don't even why, is it really true that we can't work on Sundays? And it's like that's not really what it says. Doesn't it say wasn't that talking about Saturday? That's not really Sunday. Does the church, is it really? And as soon as this question starts, we find that no one in the room really can answer the question. No one's worked through this issue, even though it's supposedly one of the 10 commandments. And by the time the conversation is over, the idea is since I don't really know, since I'm not really sure, then it can't be that big of a deal. And this is what happens one commandment at a time, one practice at a time, one doctrine at a time, until eventually the whole system of faith has been abandoned. And the reason why this incremental apostasy goes on is because when we face a conflict, when we face a situation where we have to choose between some temporal benefit and some uncertain belief, we can't muster up the sense of necessity or urgency that would lead us to say no to the temporal benefit because of the certainty of this doctrine or commandment. And this is how we slowly lose the faith, one point at a time, as we go through life and make compromise after compromise, concession after concession, decline after decline, until we're finally not living the Christian life anymore. We cannot resist temptation. We cannot suffer for the sake of Christian doctrine. We cannot sacrifice for the sake of Christian philosophy if we're not certain that it's true. If we don't know the evidence, if we haven't been personally persuaded. St. Thomas Aquinas says that a wise man seeks conviction on every subject. He seeks to know the answer to a question and to convince himself that there's a necessary answer. And that's where the strength and the discipline, the principled nature of his life is established. And what we find, and what I exposed through this sophistical disputation was that these kids were filled with ideas and assertions that they had simply picked up through their education, but none of these assertions was joined to any evidence or proof. And as a sophist, or at least acting like a sophist, I could easily get them to let go of that assertion, to be willing to concede that it might not be true. And I could do that on every issue. Sometimes because what they said was actually false and I could prove it false, but other times because even though what they said was true, I knew they wouldn't be willing to fight for it. They'd be willing to give in if I baffled them with a little bit of technical jargon, or appealed to my experience, or appealed to my education and their lack of education, or just used any of the logical fallacies in a shrewd way that they couldn't discern. But what was most important is that I could get these kids to let go of assertions because they had no evidence for them. And that's why, even though the class was entertaining, and the kids knew that I was tricking them, but they didn't know how I was tricking them. They found it entertaining. But after the fun was over, I was like a pickpocket who then presented to the kids all the stuff that I had stolen from them in the course of that disputation. And you could see that that made them uneasy, because it wasn't a joke. It wasn't a joke. And that's the problem with modern education, is that we're not actually preparing the kids to hold the faith with conviction. In order to do that, we have to furnish them with the proofs. We have to furnish them with the evidence. You may think that it's cute to say, well, the church teaches that, blah, blah, blah. But unless a kid knows for certain that the church actually does teach this, because they have the proof in front of them, that's not a conviction. They may assent, they may nod, they may repeat the catechism question, but it's not a conviction. Modern education doesn't present children with the evidence, with the proofs. It doesn't furnish them with the arts by which the Catholic faith was developed. It doesn't present them with the philosophical teachings, the arguments of the philosophers by which the truths of Christian philosophy were established and demonstrated. And it's very easy to pull these things out of their hands, because they're not certain that they're essential. And that's what the world does to Christian people. One doctrine at a time. Just gently wiggle it out of their hands. One doctrine at a time. multiplied by 10, 20, 30 years. And what we're left with in the end is a shell of Christianity, like a corpse propped up that's full of air inside until someone finally pokes it and it just dissolves into dust. In order to raise children and to raise ourselves, because adults don't know these things either and easily concede all these issues just like children. In order to change this culture, this is what I talked about in a recent talk. If we're not going to study and teach the courses and subjects that the saints and wise men studied and taught, we're going to act literally like actors in a play, like Christians without actually being Christians. We're not going to be like the martyrs. Think about the story of the Maccabees, who, because they knew that God forbid them to eat pork, were willing to die for it. Why were they so convicted? Why were they so ready to sacrifice life itself rather than eat pork? It was because they knew that God commanded that in the sacred scriptures. They knew it because they were taught the sacred scriptures. They read the sacred scriptures. They knew that this was explicitly taught to them in sacred scripture, and they knew that they had to die on that hill. Christians today don't have that conviction. They're not sure what's in the scriptures because they don't read the scriptures. They're not sure what the church actually teaches because they've never studied the catechism, and they've got some wacko on YouTube telling him that the current pope isn't even really the pope and the bishops are homosexuals and liberals who are all deceived by modern politics and trying to promote this. They're being taught to doubt and question, not actually question, but to simply be skeptical towards the actual authority of the church. And while this inclination to disobedience and disrespect for authority is easy to stir up, it's only an appearance of conviction. And the true conviction can only be found in that authority itself, which is what makes this constant criticism of the authority so evil. The sacred scriptures, the catechisms of the church, the authority of the hierarchy of the church, the philosophical sciences, the writings of great doctors of the church like Thomas Aquinas, these are the sources of true conviction and persuasion. And as long as we don't teach these things to the children and ground them in a faith that is demonstrated and certain, we're not going to raise children and we're not going to live lives ourselves that are like the lives of the martyrs or the saints who are willing to die for the sake of truth, because truth is the end of man. The exercise on whether Diet Coke is healthier than orange juice lured the kids step by step to hand over assertions that they came into the class assenting to. And it was easy. If I wanted to lure these kids away from the faith of their parents, I could easily do so. If I wanted to lure these kids into another religion, or to at least grant that another religion might be true and deny the exclusivity of their own, I could easily do so. And that should concern us. Because if I could do it in a safe environment, if I could do it in an environment that made no threats to them, cost them nothing, presented them with no intimidation or danger, and they were willing to hand over their assertions so easily and yield so easily, how much more easily will they yield to real threats, to the potential of real loss, even death? You can see there will be no resistance. And that's what's wrong with modern Christian education. We're not leading our children to conviction. We're not leading them to the sources through which they can gain certainty. We're simply teaching them the content of the Christian religion, asking them if they assent, accepting their assent as conviction, and then guarding them from questioning. And that's not education. And if we don't fix that, we're just going to see Catholic culture continue to decline and weaken and concede in the face of increasing pressure from secular influences or from other religions where some of their members do have convictions. So, that was the purpose of the Diet Coke disputation. No one ever was willing to fight me to the end on that. No one really presented a good argument. There really isn't a good argument to be made because there are too many variables. It's not really a controversial question. But those are all things that a discerning disputant would argue over before getting into the disputation. But there's no real persuasive argument in that position. And the objections that they raised were really not persuasive. And my refutations of them were more persuasive than the objections themselves. But what happened there in that disputation is what happens throughout the Christian life, one doctrine at a time, one belief at a time, one doctrine at a time, over decades and decades of life. In the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, one of the reasons why I'm hopeful, even though I'm less hopeful than I was 10 years ago, I'm hopeful because the curriculum that makes such studies accessible to children is being restored, and 10 years ago it was lost. There is hope that schools will adopt this curriculum, that homeschool parents will adopt this curriculum, and will overcome their own laziness and their own pride, because getting into subjects that you haven't studied yourself is humiliating. But parents and teachers are going to have to get over that. They're going to have to swallow their pride and not try to pretend that they're the know-it-all. They're going to have to enter into these studies with their children and be willing to work and study, and if they're not, the trend is going to continue. Education has to be a priority, and the education has to be true education. I hope that's helpful. God bless.